I think a lot of people, when they set up their own business, they hand in their notice, they have 3 months notice or 6 months notice, and then that's it. You're on your own, you're living off savings, and it's kind of, there's a countdown, right?
Yeah.
And in real estate, which is quite a lumpy sector, as in you have to do big transactions to set up a business. Your first deal is going to be many millions of pounds, and as a consequence, to do that first, you're under enormous pressure to do that first deal. And I didn't want to be under that pressure, because I think actually that's what leads to poor decision making. The self-storage space was very much onto it, but overlooked a little bit in terms of actually some of these people are also going to then want to be on site more, and we need to think about talent attraction and retention, which is if you're going to employ someone, are they going to want to sit in a kind of fairly poorly lit, kind of slightly dreary, bit echoey self-storage unit, or can we build slightly nicer reception like we have with our serviced offices? So starting to look at the opportunity set through that.
Welcome to the People Property Place podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome the founder of Compound Real Estate, Jacob Sandelson, to the show. Compound is an owner-operator with significant firepower raised from a prominent family office and will be targeting a trio of operational asset classes spanning consumer industrial, self-storage, open storage, and multi-let industrial. And I'm really, really excited to kind of unpack that in a little bit more detail. But before doing so, and before founding Compound, Jacob was a CEO and co-founder of General People, a specialist operator of serviced offices and multi-let light industrial workspace. And before this, he was a principal at General Projects, where he led the acquisition, development, and management of the properties that General People operate. He started his career at leading residential developer Galliard Homes, and it brings me great joy and a lot of pleasure to welcome him to the podcast. I know we're going to have a fascinating conversation, and I'm really excited to unpick his story, his views, opinions, and the opportunities within this space. So Jacob, welcome to the show.
Great, thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. Well, look, I guess in short, you know the drill here. I'm really keen to kind of understand and get to the bottom of like why and how you got into real estate.
So I got into real estate really accidentally and deliberately. So accidentally, I grew up with my dad, who we're very close. He worked in real estate. He was always doing innovative, I would say he was on the more innovative side of real estate developers, always having new ideas, and those ideas naturally dispersed to the dinner table. So growing up, real estate was always there, and that was something that we talked about. That said, 18-year-old me, if you'd have asked me, would have said, I don't want to go into real estate because the world is changing. I grew up in a kind of era of Facebook and Google, and actually everything was suddenly available online in the digital economy. So my plan, aged 18, was I announced to my parents, who were delighted, that I wasn't going to go to university, despite having done fairly well at school, and was instead going to set up an online fashion business.
Okay.
That went down really like a cup of cold sick. And we kind of debated it, and they said, well, you should go to university and you should follow a more linear path. I reflected on that and concluded that if I wasn't going to go to university, which was something I was fairly determined not to do, I wanted to work, I wanted to see the world and get engaged with actually my career. And then if I decided to, I could have gone back to university. If I wasn't going to do that, I should probably get a job and understand actually how the corporate world worked, rather than going and setting up a digital vintage fashion business straight out of school.
Because you were at Brighton College, right, which is a premier public school. It's very academic. Were you always very academic, or what were you like at school? And
I wouldn't say I'm very academic. I'd say I'm very competitive. So through school, I kind of moved to what mattered. So I was fortunate to end up at Brighton. Brighton does value academia, and as a consequence, when it kind of came to my GCSEs and then subsequently my A-levels, that became the thing to do, and that became the thing to focus on. So I was able to really kind of focus in, and I ended up doing fairly well.
So you probably, by all accounts, on track to go to university and kind of like follow that path. But as you touched on, your dad is a pretty well-known kind of property entrepreneur and developer. You wanted a bit of that action, and you kind of, it was split between maybe getting there, but also it was the entrepreneurial aspect rather than the real estate piece at that time that really drove you?
I think I definitely wanted a bit of that action so far as I wanted to engage with the marketplace. My plan, I had 4 or 5 offers from different universities initially to study law. So my plan was to become a lawyer, which would have obviously been a very different route. And what occurred to me was actually I didn't like studying very much. I liked understanding things, but I had a bit of an aversion to mark schemes. I had an aversion to kind of really fitting in and kind of fulfilling the status quo. Real estate felt like a solid place to start. I was fortunate to have a friend who was 6 or 7 years older than me and different family friends who had gone into real estate careers and were suddenly talking about different things. They were talking about film studios or medical clinics or hospitals or care homes. And so actually it occurred to me real estate wasn't just building flats and selling them or kind of developing office buildings. And if you want to engage with any type of commerce, it was a great place to start.
So kind of what bridged that gap or that yearning that you had in terms of kind of being creative and entrepreneurial and gravitating towards learning and getting results?
Exactly. I'd say there's kind of 2 very active parts of my mind. One side of me is very logical, very detailed, obsessed with numbers and making sense of things, which naturally lends itself quite well to kind of real estate analysis. The other side of me is much more creative, architectural, entrepreneurial, and that aspect of me kind of saw real estate and thought this makes a lot more sense than, for instance, going and working in the bond market or the stock market.
What had to happen for you to kind of get to that point? Was it that conversation with that friend, or was it just having kind of been opposed to going into real estate because that's what your old man did, actually kind of taking you traveling or a bit of a step back or failing at a business or kind of doing a few internships, you kind of learned actually this could be for me?
So I think I was very clear at the beginning of that journey that I didn't want to go into real estate. The sole reason why I was so clear was pride driven because that's what members of my family did. That said, having those conversations with different friends, and I was fortunate to have lots of different people to talk it through with, and I definitely annoyed some of them more than perhaps I was due. Being able to talk that through, it became really clear that actually from real estate as a starting place, you could, if I then decided I wanted to go and work in e-commerce, I'd understand that from a real estate perspective. Look at the shed market as an example, which has been completely transformed by e-commerce. My fashion business was effectively e-commerce. So it's a great starting point to be able to learn any other industry, but without the risk of complete value destruction. Whereas real estate, you obviously have a tangible asset, which is much easier to value than a tech startup.
Yeah. So an 18-year-old, Jacob finishing Brighton College, how did you go about finding your first job, or what did you kind of do?
So I would say the key limiting factor was obviously that I hadn't been to university. So I had this logical side of my brain, and I had good grades, and I could clearly talk commercially. I was always fortunate in that respect and won a couple of different competitions growing up around entrepreneurship and that type of thing. But if I were to have walked into the offices of Brockton or Mark or Blackstone or any of the kind of big or the kind of mid-cap and then larger PE houses, which is kind of where I would have said I would have wanted to have worked and wanted to have learned, they would have said, well, you don't have a degree, so you can't work there. So as a starting point, I really needed somewhere where I could learn the industry. And what I've been kind of advised by a couple of these friends as well, they said, start somewhere where people know the name. Because if you rock up and say, hey, I'm Jacob and I work for so-and-so business and people haven't heard of it, then they haven't heard of you and they haven't heard of the business you work for. It's much easier to carry someone's attention.
Good piece of advice.
So what I was able to do, I knew that you didn't need, so I started in sales at Galliard. I knew that you didn't need a degree to sell flats. That was something that was kind of evident, and I was able to kind of start by doing that. I convinced David Gallman, who was my first boss, to give me a job. I sent a lot of CVs out to different people. I knew him through somebody else and convinced him to let me start. I'd seen a couple of different people who were actually even younger than me and had less qualifications who had gone through that route and actually done quite well out of it. So that was kind of really my first foot in the door, was selling flats dotted around the M25 for Galliard.
And you kind of, it sounds like there are a few barriers in the way, but just through some hard work and trying to pull in some relationships and knocking a lot of doors, you managed to kind of get yourself in the room and at least get one foot in the door. But then it was kind of utilising all those salesman skills to at least get your second foot through the door and get a contract to start selling homes. So were you any good at it?
I was terrible. So I think you have to have realistic expectations. And so my starting point was, great, I'm going to be doing property deals for some big private equity firm. That wasn't going to happen. I was 18 years old. I had no experience and didn't know the market or what I was talking about. Galliard gave me that double foot in the door. And basically my job from when I started was selling flats, primarily dotted around the M25, some in more central parts of London. And I think really there were two sides. I would say there were two sides of my learning and job in that first year or so. One was learning how to interact with people and learning how to be in an office and learn, obviously these are things that people do largely from home now, but actually learning how to be professional and be somebody in the workplace. And then the other side was understanding ultimately what makes a market tick. And I was incredibly fortunate at Galliard. They had a large portfolio of residential. So I was able to look across the market and see, okay, people want flats in Hounslow because they're this price and this appeals to these buy-to-let investors. This was before, obviously, all the stamp duty changes and the interest relief changes and everything. So it was still that market of off-plan buy-to-let investors. I was able to see that side of the market and see that that's what drove that. And then equally, there was a development in Eltham, which all went to owner-occupiers who wanted to live there because Eltham's a nice place to live and it was reasonably priced and there was good mortgage availability for Eltham. So I've got to see if you kind of talk about it like an appraisal, I got to see the GDV side of an appraisal first, which most people listening to this will know is the most important part is what's something worth when it's done.
Yeah, sure. And so, did you become good at sales?
So I got incredibly lucky. I wouldn't say I was good at consumer sales, but effectively the job, and David, my first boss, said it to me. He said, effectively the job is the longer you are here, as in hours in the day, the more you engage with it, the more kind of leads you follow up and kind of old leads you try and revive and different people that you try and meet who might be interested in selling or in buying apartments, the better you will do, because it's just conversion rates, right? It's exactly the same as what you do, or to some extent what I do today. It's engaging with the market.
Quality times quantity. You'll over a long period of time, you'll do well, right? If you stick
exactly.
With it.
So it's hard work, and so I committed to work really hard. I would say I wasn't especially good at sales because that's not my natural instinct is to sell something to someone. My natural instinct is to think, would I buy this? And obviously, if you're trying to maximize best value or best price, that's not necessarily what you can do. I got incredibly lucky. I picked up the phone. So this was about a year in. This would have been 2015, 16. I picked up the phone to the head of property or the head of affordable housing for a large central London borough, who for the previous 5 or 6 years of the cycle had been taking Section 106 and affordable off-site contributions or affordable payment in lieu contributions and needed to buy significant quantums of housing within 40 minutes of this London borough to
qualify
to effectively spend all of that off-site affordable money.
Yeah.
So it was completely through dumb luck. I picked up the phone to this guy. I said, let me send you some options. He seemed quite relieved. I think he tried a couple of times, but the problem is when you work in a sales team, the ambition is really get deals done now. And he was never going to be somebody who bought an apartment or even 2 or 3 apartments in the next month and the next set of targets. They ended up buying a lot more than 1 or 2 apartments. And that was a kind of really interesting way for me to start getting into really understanding how developments work and their specification and how capital worked as well. They couldn't pay full price for these apartments. And at the same, sorry, I appreciate we're jumping around a bit, but at the same time as doing this kind of sales learning role at Galliard, I'd also realized I needed to learn about financial modeling. So I've been doing a course in the evenings doing that. And one of the first things they teach you when you do that is around time value of money. So this council couldn't pay the full price that we, Galliard, wanted at the time for these apartments, they were about 10, 12, even 12% off. That said, they had all the capital sitting there now, and we hadn't started building these apartments. So the deal I proposed to both my boss and the person from the council that we ended up transacting with was, we'll give them a discount, but they'll give us significant quantums of that capital up front, which I now know is a forward fund. But at the time, I wouldn't have had the vocabulary to talk about that, which suddenly gave me insight into understanding about construction, understanding about legal, understanding about title, because you had to go to meetings with all of those different departments to be able to get that forward fund signed off internally.
So what I'm hearing, a few things in here is like, you've mentioned kind of lucky a couple of times, but it sounds like you kind of created your own luck. It also sounds like you're very hardworking, and you kind of pushed the bar and did things that maybe your contemporaries wouldn't. But also outside of those hours that you're kind of pulling, you're also kind of trying to learn an additional skill set, kind of skill stack and layer on, and broaden your understanding of the real estate space. And it sounds like you managed to kind of combine all of those to kind of like pull this deal in together. And I guess as an 18, 19-year-old, did you ever feel that people weren't going to take you seriously, or is it?
Completely. And that was why I did this night course. So I think I definitely, about a year into the Galliard process, had a chip on my shoulder around the university decision, which was actually, if I'm going to work in investment, which is what I knew I wanted to end up doing, then there were kind of core technical skills which I needed to learn, which I didn't have, and people would know I didn't have as a consequence of not going to university. So I found I would say he was a burnt out investment banker who was ex-JP Morgan, who was in his late 20s, early 30s, who had left his corporate job and was actually tutoring in financial modeling. So I spent a large portion of the savings I had to learn that skill set with him, which again gave me the insight, I suppose, to be able to do the affordable council deal. Yeah. But at the same time, another skill which I knew I was going to be able to use down the line and knew was a kind of prerequisite to be able to work in investment.
How did you know that? Was that advice from your family or peers, or because not everyone would? Just trying to think of someone who doesn't have family members who are in real estate investment or development. They might not necessarily know that they need to add that skill set to their armory. Were you advised, or was it just kind of intuition? Or
I think if you look through, so I did a couple of different things. I was interested as to what I was missing. So if you look through a Reading real estate course, for instance, you can see that a lot of real estate valuation, real estate financial modeling, discounted cash flows, net present values, IRRs, metrics, etc., were a core part of that course. And I didn't know what any of those abbreviations meant. So I thought there's probably something I should learn. So that was one starting point. Two, the benefit of Galliard, whilst it's a big business, it's one of the largest private residential developers in the country, is it's also a family business and it's relatively open. So you could talk to other people in the business and say, how do I end up doing your job? Or how do you spend your time, to the person whose job looks quite interesting? And they would say, I spend most of my time looking at new deals. I'd say, okay, well, what does that entail? They say, I spend most of my time on Microsoft Excel. And at the time, I kind of knew how to change the font of Microsoft Excel. And so that was kind of an obvious hole, which I was then able to fill.
Brilliant. So you did this big forward fund deal. Mm-hmm. Did you manage to kind of negotiate that through?
So I was, again, very fortunate. And I think it's the benefit of Galliard being a private company. And I've always been fortunate that I've been surrounded, everywhere I've worked, I've been surrounded by people who have been willing to let me have a bit of a run at it, rather than the slightest sign of a good thing happening and suddenly your boss steps in and does everything. So Galliard let me run with this affordable forward funding deal, and they gave me all the support I needed from their legal team, from their construction team, from third-party lawyers, from the investment analyst who was running the deal at Galliard. But ultimately, they let me carry on having the kind of really acting as principal with the other side and having those conversations with the buyer. So we, through about 6 or 7 months of negotiation, we took that from an idea to heads of terms to a contract that ultimately got exchanged, and 18 months later that got completed and they took possession of the flats.
Amazing. And that was your first real estate deal, just a small one then?
It was, I remember when we were trying to sign, it was really exciting I was 19 years old. It was really exciting. I remember when we were trying to get them to sign heads of terms, I didn't appreciate most people actually, you don't sign heads of terms, they just get agreed and then you send them to a lawyer. Like, you don't have a big signing ceremony, but I was expecting that you would have a signing ceremony. So I kind of was messaging the person saying, can we meet to sign the heads of terms, which I think he was a bit miffed by, but it was an exciting moment.
Yeah, just showing the fact you are actually 19
Yeah,
at the other end
exactly.
of the table. So before we kind of move on to general projects and how that kind of came around in the next part of the story, just to kind of round it off, I'm assuming majority of your friends went to university, and you kind of
Pretty
touched
much
on that earlier. Did you ever feel that you're missing out? Or did you kind of feel that you could go and see them and they're kind of indebted with student debt and you'd been hustling and making money and we're buying everyone drinks at the local bar? Like, how did you reconcile that? Because they're off meeting new friends, you're trying to sell flats around the M25, and you've got to be pretty headstrong to decide not to do it, but also to not kind of buckle after a year or so and go and join them.
Yeah, so I think again, because I went to boarding school in Brighton, so I had the benefit of going to boarding school in the middle of the city, which is also a university town. So I managed to have a fair amount of that experience in my teens. And then, as you say, a lot of friends at Bristol and Oxford and Cambridge, a couple at Durham, and actually I was able to go and see them for the weekend. And it felt quite good to have a job and to have money and not have a student loan and to be doing something a bit different, which I would say has always been the case with me. I never wanted to necessarily just go down the status quo path.
Amazing, I love it. General projects, how did that come into the frame, and why did you decide to kind of leave Galliard Homes? Because it sounded like you're onto kind of a good thing.
Yeah, so Galliard is an amazing business. It's also a big business, and again, I think I would definitely describe myself as ambitious, and I had determined that I wanted to learn, but also wanted to do lots quickly, which I recognised I needed to do for a small business, or do within a small business, where actually there isn't an entire team that deals with construction, or there isn't an entire team that deals with development or planning or land acquisition. I kind of thought actually the best way for me to be able to learn would be to be embedded in a small business where maybe 5 or 6 people are all doing full life cycle development and therefore getting lots of experience across all of that. But that business you need to have good people running it, because ultimately the plan is to learn. Yeah. So the progression from Galliard to general projects was actually with a little bit of a bump in the middle. Leaving Galliard, I didn't actually go straight to general projects, but I went to work for my dad initially, and that was the plan. Dad is a kind of big maverick entrepreneur. He's incredibly good at what he does. And I saw that as really impressive and something that I wanted to be involved with. That said, I think perhaps what I'd underestimated was what it would be like working as a father and son. So we did that for, I think, about 5 working days. And we've always been very close. And after 5 days, I think we concluded that if we did another 5 days, we would probably be less close. So little bit of a career hiccup 2 years in, which I was then back to talking to very similar friends about what should I do next. And this is not such a good plan, but I know that leaving big company to work for small company is the right kind of overall objective. So I spoke to lots of different friends, and one of them, who is a little bit older than me, said, you should meet my friend. He's a guy called Jacob Loftus, who's just left a company called Resolution, which is on the larger side real estate private equity fund that I would have liked to have worked for once upon a time. And he's actually just set up his own business. It's called General Projects. You should check it out. So I was introduced to Jacob, and we met for a coffee in the co-working space where General Projects started out, in literally just around the corner in Henry Wood House. And yeah, I took a job there.
And so you were the first employee?
No, I was the third employee. Okay. So not quite the first, but it was very much kind of startup phase. I would say the business was probably 5 months old, 6 months old when I joined.
And did they have any assets under management, or what were you kind of walking into?
So the starting point for General Projects was that offices, and it's a lot of what's spoken about now kind of everywhere today, but the starting point for GP was that actually the office experience should be much more like walking into a boutique hotel. It should be coupled with service and amenity. There should be a great coffee shop in the lobby. It should be well designed. It should be thought about from a kind of consumer perspective rather than does it have the right air conditioning to cater for the density which we're going to put in the JLL leasing brochure? So when I joined, the mission statement or the ambition of General Projects was, let's build best-in-class office HQs that appeal for the next generation of tier one office tenants who value all of those amenities and value space in a very different way to the historic office market. So when I joined, there were two projects. One was a building in Clerkenwell, and the other was Number One Poultry on Bank Junction.
Yeah, I know the one opposite the Ned, right? It's kind
Exactly.
of that quite unique
and the Bloomberg building.
Yeah, it's quite a unique architectural business building, that One Poultry. And so, what was your role then? What were you kind of going to General Projects to do?
So my starting title was investment analyst. In terms of what I did week one, I think Jacob and I sat down and he said, what interests you? What opportunities, or where do you use real estate, was really the starting point. So we looked at that, and we looked at transport networks, and we looked at how the world was changing and how specifically London as a city had changed a lot in the kind of 7, 8, 9, 10 years since digital had started to creep into the kind of physical environment. Transport connections getting better, cost of distance going down, e-commerce use going up. And so we spent a lot of time looking at that and looking at London's new villages. So the rise of kind of proper office buildings with proper office tenants popping up in parts of Whitechapel and then parts of Brixton. And then suddenly, actually, if it's parts of Whitechapel, could it not move out to Hackney Wick? And looking at that evolution of the way that people were working was really my first role. And then originating buildings and speaking to agents and finding market data and then running appraisals to look at, should we buy that building or should we not buy that building?
Did you find it a kind of a challenge moving from residential to commercial, or was it just literally applying the same skills and the same things that you'd learned at Galliard, but just applying that in a slightly different real estate context?
I think I was so green working at Galliard that I was completely malleable enough that it didn't really occur to me at the time that this was a change. But I definitely saw commercial as a space of having much more opportunity to do something different, and also having much more room to move from a financial perspective. So far as, generally speaking, you underwrite a commercial development to have a slightly bigger margin than a residential development because they're less established markets.
And because you obviously didn't have a degree, what was it you thought Jacob Loftus saw in you that gave you the job or gave you the opportunity?
Very good question. I would say that probably twofold. One, I was able to talk a little bit about what I'd done at Galliard, so I clearly didn't know absolutely nothing, but equally I was young enough, and I was, in term from an employment perspective, and now running my own business, I recognise the benefits in this. I was young enough that I was also affordable enough to hire, and it was a relatively low risk hire from his perspective because you're not paying someone very kind of significant salary, whereas actually, had I been working for 3 or 4 years somewhere else and I'd been in an investment bank or a private equity fund, then to bring that person in would cost that much more.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. It's quite a low risk hire, and he betted on the behaviours you demonstrated, and I guess could teach you the functional skills, or you kind of had an insatiable appetite to kind of learn them as you had with your modelling skills outside of your day job. To come good. So you were with General Projects all in all for about 5 years, right? Mm-hmm. And within that, can you just talk to me a little bit about your journey, the kind of projects you were involved with, and also kind of general people as well? Yeah.
So as I said about moving from Galliard, the benefit of joining General Projects and joining it at the very early stages, Jacob was an incredibly smart, incredibly connected, proven track record founder, but it was a small enough business where both I could learn from him and learn from him directly, but also be able to roll my sleeves up and learn about planning and learn about complex titles and look at different asset classes and kind of do research projects which could then translate into new sectors. So that was the genesis, and the starting point was it was a fairly open brief of what did we it was a team of 4 at the time, collectively find interesting and think was kind of going to work in a kind of changing world. So about a year into General Projects, obviously the WeWork story was starting to take off. There was huge quantums of kind of venture capital kind of pushing into the co-working space. And it was a sector that we looked at and we were understanding. And obviously from a tenant perspective, it was popping up on any office building you were developing at the time in the city fringe, West End, anywhere. WeWork, The Office Group, Regus, Spaces, Landmark, etc., were all popping up on the list of people who had requirements in those markets. And so we were kind of looking at it. We were also developing number one poultry at the time, which eventually was a building that was leased to WeWork. And we were looking at the serviced office space by extension of that and thinking, this makes complete sense from a consumer perspective. So far as if you're a small business, as you'll know, as I know, if you're a small business, like finding space to run that business on flexible enough terms that if you have to grow or contract, it can be accommodated, whilst providing really high quality amenities in terms of, not actually really high quality amenities, fairly basic amenities in terms of somewhere to get a cup of coffee, a meeting room to rent when you've got clients or investors or other people coming into the office. That offering to the SME economy was really smart, and the SME economy accounts for the vast majority of employment. It's like, I think circa 65-70% of people work for small and medium-sized businesses, and the opportunity to rent space was pretty poor. So we saw that they were solving a problem, all of these serviced office businesses, from a consumer perspective. That said, if you looked at the numbers, they were underwriting off desk rates, which ultimately translated into pound per square foot rates for small rooms. And then when you put fairly high rents in there wasn't that much room to move. And the vast majority of these businesses were fairly weak covenants. You could look back 15 years, 20 years and see what had happened to Regus in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And actually the risk to a landlord was fairly inherent, but the user demand, the occupational demand was phenomenal. And so we saw all of that and thought, actually, we should be able to provide the operational piece as well as the design piece and the amenity piece to these buildings. And actually by doing so, we'll be offering investors a much better risk-adjusted return than if they buy a building, rent it to WeWork, and then hope that WeWork doesn't go bust. So that was the kind of genesis of General Projects moving into the serviced office space, and then subsequently us setting up General People.
Yeah, I completely get it. It's just a mindset shift right into operational real estate, which is a massive buzzword that's been thrown around for the last few years. But as you kind of touched on, inherently, it's kind of that opco propco. And the propco piece wouldn't necessarily touch the operational real estate, although obviously some did, because it's a different skill set and it's different risk and liability, and you've got to kind of get your head around it.
I think it had happened a lot more in the living sector. So student accommodation had kind of come of age, build to rent, PRS, they were all buzzwords. That was all kind of those huge amounts of kind of pension and insurance money moving into that. All of that is inherently operational, and they were being valued as kind of proper core assets that long-term institutional investors wanted to hold. That just hadn't filtered through into the commercial space at the time. I think that's still got quite a long way to go. But at the end of the day, it's effectively the same principles of you've just got very diversified income coming in against your asset. So as long as you can put the right systems, the right software, the right processes in place, as you would with any actual development, it wasn't actually that different, or at least that's how we looked at it.
And so you co-founded General People with Jacob. Can you just talk to me about that sort of venture and how that kind of came about? So
the first asset, we bought a building in the Royal Docks, which was an operational serviced office, but it was what I would describe as a 1990s serviced office. So it's actually much more akin to The Office TV show in terms of what you would get as you walked in. Everything was fairly dark. Everything was quite dingy. The top rent in that building was circa £28-29 a foot gross. So this was really cheap space on the edge of town that we bought because we thought this is a smart property purchase. But at the same time, it was a really interesting way to test out everything that we'd been playing around with from a serviced office. Long term, can we build this portfolio and can we build this operating platform? So that was the first asset which we acquired as General Projects in October 2018. That had the benefit of having all of these tenants, which whilst they weren't paying a huge amount of rent, it was a great starting point. It was a great way to learn a new sector without being able to mess it up too much, because you've already got yield and actually you've got a bit more room to move in terms of capital and long-term direction. And because we had 160 people in the building, or 160 businesses in the building, about 1,000 people in the building, we would be able to spot the trends of what we were doing right or wrong fairly quickly. So that was
Rather
the
than
first.
build it completely.
Exactly, rather than starting completely from scratch. So that was the first asset. And that was, as general projects, what became apparent to us fairly quickly from when we started running that asset was, so 162 businesses in the building, you've now got to charge rent to 162 businesses. You've got to charge them rent monthly. Then some of them say, can we rent a meeting room for an hour or 2 hours? Or can we actually forward buy some meeting rooms because we're going away, so we're not going to get around to paying for them, but some of our colleagues are going to use them over the next couple of months. Then you realize the people you're dealing with don't really understand real estate, and they're small business owners who just want a bit of a break. It's busy, they have full lives, they have families. Like, actually, they want that side of things to be quite straightforward and easy. So I think it came to our attention quite quickly that we needed to make sure that the processes, the infrastructure, how we were providing a great service to the people working in this building got that much better. That was one side. The other side was everyone in that building, when we took it over, was on 1 month rolling breaks. So we also needed to build a proper sales infrastructure to support new people coming into that building, whereas the business we bought it from had a central office and a team that dealt with all of that. So that was really the genesis of General People.
Can you talk to me about General People today and kind of the size and scale and what that business does?
So we took that building, which was this called Expressway in the Royal Docks, and we fully refurbished it. We turned it into what I would say is the best quality value-driven workspace kind of east of Canary Wharf in the kind of M25 London sphere. It's a circa 50% discount even today from Canary Wharf, and you're 6 minutes drive away. So that became the kind of basis for what we were doing, which was because we owned the buildings, we were able to run them at significant discounts in terms of consumer price to what a Regis or a Tog would charge you for the space. So our kind of whole model was we can make sure that our occupancy is always good across these buildings because we run at much better EBITDA margins. So from there, we carried that through, and General People ended up expanding to a number of different locations. And we bought again, all as general projects, feeding assets to General People. We bought a kind of multi-let industrial estate kind of studio space in North London called the Frontier Clothing Village. We started operating what started out as 45,000 square foot in Canary Wharf, which has actually then grown as space has been taken up, and that's worked out well. And again, also in Elephant and Castle, and looking at effectively how can we provide value-driven workspace in slightly off-pitch locations closer to where people work, and doing that through an owner-operated model so that the quality is still exactly the same, as in it's as good as a WeWork or an Uncommon or a Tog. I would actually say better, but that was kind of the starting point of what we were trying to do.
And I bet your investors loved it.
Yeah, it went really well for them. Again, that coming back to that thesis of you end up with 160 businesses in a building. So through COVID, whilst on the face of it, having 160 people on 1 month rolling breaks in the first building in March 2020 doesn't sound like the most exciting proposition, or it actually sounds like a fairly terrifying proposition, and it was, speaking from experience. What we saw quite quickly was there were far more levers we could pull, far more we could do for our users than perhaps a conventional major office landlord. You've just got much more diversified income.
I guess, yeah, a few different levers you can play and look after them. They'll look after you longer term, and it sounds like that's exactly what happened.
So we ended up, what was also really interesting about investing in the office space outside of core markets is by May 2020, we were having 600 people a day back into that building in the Royal Docks, which is about 60% of what it was in March 2020. But compared to the office stats that were coming out of some of the larger managing agents about core West End and city offices in 2020, 2021, that was quite a nice piece of data to be able to see.
And I guess day to day then, your role had shifted from being kind of acquisitions, development, management orientated at general projects to kind of running General People and kind of being all consumed with that as kind of co-founder and CEO of that business.
So it was really split across the two. And I think, again, a big part of what we were trying to do was by buying buildings, developing them, and then operating them ourselves, we were able to create benefits across the building service charge, to create benefits across how we use the building lobby. And so applying both a development mindset and still keeping one foot in that door, whilst also building and investing in building a really good operational team, both in terms of people and software, infrastructure, data, Wi-Fi, how we approached all of that, enabled us to operate all of these buildings really well. So it was kind of keeping both sides of that line, kind of staying across both sides of that line.
You left General Projects in 2022?
2021.
2021.
Yeah.
Why did you leave? Because the business has gone on and had some phenomenal success, won lots of awards, and has kind of, as you said, pioneered a lot of change in kind of commercial office, best in class, design-led investment development. Why did you leave, and what did you go on to do after that?
So General People was an amazing experience in kind of building a platform of operational real estate for institutional investors, but realizing what works and what doesn't. So General People, the ultimate investor or the ultimate owner in most of those buildings was a pension fund. So they were looking for the kind of yield premiums that we were able to offer by running it as kind of vertically integrated operational space. That was working really well. We built a great team there, and that had interested me in lots of different sectors. So I was looking at the dark kitchen space, or eventually the self-storage space, or we looked at caravan parks and lots of different alternative sectors where actually there was a kind of operational integration piece. And I think what I concluded was what I was really good at was combining the real estate side with the operating side to maximize the value for both, whilst providing a great experience for a user, good return for an investor. And so I'd always wanted to set up my own business. I think the General People story had been a really good kind of success story. We'd taken it to a really good place. We built a great team. The assets that we were running at the time were running really well. And starting to look at what was next, I wanted to apply exactly the same model to other sectors where I thought the same opportunity existed.
And so talk to me about how you went about setting up your own business, because clearly you're onto a good thing here. You've risen up the ranks, you've co-founded the business with your previous boss, you've made it a success of it. How do you go about setting up a business? Like where did you start? You kind of touched on wanting to apply some of the learnings within a different asset class. Can you just talk to me about how Compound kind of came to be?
Yeah. So across the General People portfolio, which got to be about circa 300,000 square foot, once a week I would sit down with a different person now, but our head of sales at the time, and we'd run through these are all of the inquiries that have come into the business, this is where they're coming from, these are the people who have viewed, these are the people who have taken space. So the key thing with running these operational kind of platforms is you need to stay incredibly close to where's your demand coming from, and really seeing that, especially in fringier markets, which is what we were doing. And for kind of 3 or 4 consecutive weeks, we'd lost businesses in different serviced office buildings we were running to self-storage operators nearby. And that kind of stood out as something which I found quite interesting, and had spent a bit of time Googling and reading online. I'd been a kind of passive viewer of Safe Store and Big Yellow share prices for a few years, but that was the kind of first exposure to the self-storage space. At the same time, watching other kind of industrial asset classes or kind of industrial sub-asset classes becoming more and more operational. So we'd run a dark kitchen in one of our serviced offices where we'd had an industrial workshop unit which we couldn't let. So we'd actually partnered with a business to do that, and as a consequence had great exposure to, again, who are the users, what are the unit economics, how does it work, what can we do better than the competition, who are the competition. And again, concluding that the value was all in the real estate of doing that, I concluded that I wanted to set up a portfolio similar to we built General People and Serviced Office of primarily self-storage, but ultimately I would describe it as consumer industrial for kind of to cater to those businesses that we were watching move out of our serviced offices.
And why were those businesses, and what types of businesses were moving out? Because was there a theme there as well?
Yeah, so I think starting with self-storage, there's really kind of two types of users. The vast majority of a traditional user of self-storage is a domestic user. It's somebody who lives nearby. Generally, it's because they're moving house or because of some type of significant life event. So whether that's death, divorce, a dislocation, movement, that type of thing. And so that's the kind of traditional reason why people have liked the space. It's fantastic. That continues today. But what has changed over the past 10 or so years, 15 years, which has obviously completely changed within the entire industrial space, is e-commerce penetration. So the internet, Amazon, originally eBay, a bunch of other sites have made it that much easier for one-man bands through to 3 or 4-man bands to own and operate a business which entirely sells stock online. So we had a business, one of the ones that we lost from one of our serviced office buildings, whose sole good that they sold, they would mass import HDMI cables from China. Tens of thousands of HDMI cables would be shipped into the serviced office unit, and then they would sell them on Amazon. So that's a kind of key driver of demand, is the kind of micro e-commerce business. And we were looking at that and thinking, actually, there should be a serviced flex alternative for those types of businesses, which is overlooked a little bit. The self-storage space was very much onto it, but overlooked a little bit in terms of actually some of these people are also going to then want to be on site more, and we need to think about talent attraction and retention, which is if you're going to employ someone, are they going to want to sit in a kind of fairly poorly lit, kind of slightly dreary, bit echoey self-storage unit, or can we build slightly nicer reception like we have with our serviced offices? So starting to look at the opportunity set through that.
Wow, it's fascinating because I know, from talking to a few other people, as you touched on, like death, divorce, displacement, it's quite a defensive investment, right? Self-storage, but because of these people selling HDMI cables or perfume or what have you, and they've maxed out their space in their little one-bed flat, or they can't actually get it ordered to their office, they need to be able to serve notice on a day, right?
Exactly.
Or they need to be able to double it.
Or their girlfriend has said to them they can't keep selling HDMI cables from their flat.
And so they need a space.
Exactly.
And were you kind of looking at different graphs or what kind of data were you looking into to kind of like try and track this?
So I've followed the growth of the SME economy incredibly closely because that was a huge part of the general people thesis. So it was all around, I think something like 99% of businesses in the UK are SMEs, circa 70% of people who work for a business work for SMEs. So we'd followed that incredibly closely. We then also followed e-commerce penetration rates incredibly closely because you couldn't miss it. If you watch Amazon share price, if you looked at Segro's share price for that matter, if you looked at actually where capital flows were going within the real estate space, it was evident, which kind of brings us back to the earlier part of this conversation, which is big macro trends in the economy eventually end up impacting real estate. And I think that's what we try and look at and kind of react from. So it was kind of evident on a macro level that this was happening. We were also watching it happen within our own serviced office business and thinking, okay, well, that's actually your user. We know them. They were once upon a time a user of ours, and we can know what these people are doing, which is better, which is increased flexibility, slightly lower cost.
And so you identified that kind of trend. How do you go about building a business off the back of that?
So spent a lot of time reading share reports, earnings announcements from the benefit of self-storage is the vast majority of really high quality space is owned by listed businesses who obviously are quite transparent with data. So we kind of, we started by saying, should it be self-storage or dark kitchens? That was a debate that I spent, and again, went back to lots of different friends and people as we'd spoken about earlier and kind of had that conversation with and tried it out with a couple of different investors and potential investors to kind of gauge response and gauge reaction as to what they thought, and really got quite detailed into, what are the benefits, what are the cons, what are the risks, what if actually why would people not need self-storage, or what would happen if there was a very significant recession which hit kind of consumer spending and massively rising unemployment, what would then happen to self-storage rents? And so we got right into the detail of that on a kind of very macro, quite kind of theoretical level before we started looking at, okay, this is then how you would go it, this is the kind of site you would buy, and this is the price you would pay for it, and this is how much it costs to build, which was then the second phase of that journey.
You speak a lot about we did this. Who was we? Or was it you?
Primarily me.
So you did it.
Primarily me. I'm incredibly fortunate to, as I said, I've always been surrounded by good mentors, good friends, good ex-bosses. I spent an awful lot of time talking to the original team I used to work with at Galliard, talking to Jacob, who was my one-time boss and then co-founder at General People, speaking to different partners and potential investors in Compound who were close and people who I kind of had helped me through my career, if that made sense.
So and just sounding it past them, more seasoned people, just to see if I guess...
There's always so much that you can learn from other people, and there's only so much you can get from data and quantitative analysis. And so by that, I mean, real estate is a people industry, hence the podcast name. And people are always having conversations and tangential conversations about actually, oh, that thing's not going so well, or I've got this building and we've got this vacant space and we've been approached by 4 self-storage operators, or this person's setting up a dark kitchen business and they've moved into my shopping centre. Or so you're then getting those qualitative bits of information from other people in the market, and that's all feeding back into eventually your decision making as to what's your strategy going to be, how are you going to be different to the other people, what's the return going to look like for an investor, and what problem are you ultimately solving for a user, which I think really is the key question you should be asking yourself with any type of real estate you're developing now.
So you spent quite a lot of time on this thesis.
Yeah.
What comes first? Money, assets?
It's a catch-22. I would say definitely, unfortunately, not people. It would be great if you could have people to be working on that with, because really setting up a business and pairing both assets with capital when you're a new business and I was doing this in late 2021, early 2022, when you're a new business doing it right at the top of the market, it's a very challenging thing to do from an asset perspective. So as a consequence, I largely focused on the capital side first. I got the thesis working, as in I wrote the business plan and we kind of knew this is what we're saying and this is the return profile that we think we can offer our investors. This is why we think it's more defensive than investing with other people's business plans in these alternative spaces. And this is why we think you should do it with us rather than other people, which was our background in understanding operational real estate, understanding how to make the best out of a user experience in operational real estate, but ultimately keep it as institutional as you possibly can from a equity long-term investment perspective.
And did you quit your job and go all in on this, or was it a case of just trying to write the business plan, raise the capital while still doing your job, and then kind of try and seamlessly exit?
So I was very fortunate because I transitioned out of general projects and was really kind of running the General People business at the time. I had a bit of time to kind of really kind of make, I think a lot of people when they set up their own business, they hand in their notice, they have 3 months notice or 6 months notice, and then that's it, you're on your own, you're living off savings, and it's kind of, there's a countdown, right?
Yeah.
And in real estate, which is quite a lumpy sector, as in you have to do big transactions to set up a business. Your first deal is going to be many millions of pounds, and as a consequence, to do that first, you're under enormous pressure to do that first deal, and I didn't want to be under that pressure, because I think actually that's what leads to poor decision making. So I was in a fairly fortunate position so far as I was running General People. I was therefore getting amazing exposure to all of the operational real estate that I was talking about, and that ultimately I wanted Compound, my business today, to be an expert in. And as a consequence, I really kind of took my time to make sure that we built the General People team, made sure that that business carried on running in a kind of really positive way that would kind of safeguard those assets and kind of provide the soft infrastructure for those assets for the long term, whilst also planning exactly what we were going to do, but not thinking, oh, we've got 4 weeks left till we run out of money, or 3 weeks to go, 2 weeks to go, we better sign this deal because, oh God, we're out of money.
Yeah, because we need the fee income.
I never wanted that to happen, and I was acutely aware that industrial pricing, which is ultimately the type of land we needed to buy, had been going up and up and up and up and up throughout that entire period. And what I didn't want to do was overpay for our first asset.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. Easier said than done though, right?
It's true. It's true. And again, I come back to that's why you need to be surrounded by good people, good investors, patient investors, and you need to allow yourself to value those people, because it's frustrating. When you set up a small business, you want to get going, you want to do deals, right?
Oh, 100%. I think, is it a term that you kind of coined, consumer industrial, self-storage, open storage, multi-let industrial, or is that a kind of more widely acknowledged segment within this kind of ever-expanding industrial niche?
I'd love to say I coined it, but I think in practice it's been around for years, which is if you go to most industrial estates, there's so much weird and wonderful subletting, whether it's artist studios, whether it's dark kitchens, whether it's photography studios, podcast rooms, gyms who are kind of renting out by memberships, kind of breakout serviced office and co-working spaces. There are businesses who have been providing operational iterations of industrial space for decades and decades and decades. But I think as any market comes of age and matures and more capital starts to look at it, then all of those subsectors become a bit more shiny as well. And people start to kind of think, okay, well, how do we turn this from something that's happening on the back of an industrial estate to something that's actually an asset class in its own right?
Can we just talk on the capital piece? How did you go about raising the capital? Because you've got your thesis, you know what you're doing. How is it kissing a lot of different frogs? Is it using a placement agent? Is it leveraging friends and family? Is it multiple different investors? How did you go about kind of securing that commitment?
So I think I kind of went by what I'd had the benefit of being at General Projects and watching Jacob grow that business and looking at how he'd approach capital and all the same challenges and different types of investor and what worked and what didn't and who were the easier investors to speak to for different profiles of assets, and understanding how you would match the two was something as an experience that I took completely from the time I spent at General Projects. And in terms of how I went about it, this was through Q1, Q2, Q3 2022. So it was kind of really the last or the very end of the top of the cycle and the top of the industrial boom, where there was huge amounts of capital all trying to access various iterations of one asset class, which is sheds. And so I think that definitely helped in terms of doing that, kind of having those conversations, which is you were going to people with new ideas as to how to get premium returns in an asset class where a lot of investors felt priced out. So that was a kind of starting point. So then it was thinking about who are the different types of capital to speak to. So again, very fortunate through primarily people I'd worked with along the way, had different conversations with different investors and potential investors. Those ranged from large American private equity through to family offices, through to high net worth individuals, and kind of got to see, okay, well, this is how these different types of people operate. You obviously have the initial meetings. Most people after the initial meeting say, it sounds really interesting, talk to us a bit more, show us a deal, how would the terms, but there's normally a kind of takeaway from that first meeting. So you get to experience working with somebody a little bit in that first kind of couple of meetings. Obviously, for the best part of this cycle, the dominant force in buying industrial had been American private equity. Yeah. So we ultimately came down to having, like at the end of our process, I had really two people who I was really interested in working with. One was a big USP fund, and the other was a kind of very significant, very experienced, very strategic, selective family office. And I think backdating 2 or 3 years, the PE guys would have been quicker to deploy, for sure. But I was also, and as I've said it throughout this, I'm acutely aware, I'm young, I'm learning. You want people who are on the ground, who are challenging you, who bring a lot of experience to the table as well. I'd partly done that because as part of the whole kind of soft infrastructure setup for Compound, we'd taken on as chairman the former head of operations and main board member from SafeStore, one of the main board members from SafeStore, so kind of providing some grey hair and some strategic oversight. But beyond that, I wanted somebody who had invested in the UK through cycles and cycles and cycles and actually saw the opportunities that I thought were coming in terms of some real estate downturn, reducing asset prices, that's the buying opportunity, but also someone who's got conviction that that remains the buying opportunity. Whereas I think obviously it's much harder to do that if you're allocating and you've got the opportunity, if you're a US private equity fund, to go and buy sheds in Germany if that's a better alternative because the UK macro doesn't look so great.
Yeah, I mean, that marries so closely to the conversations that I'm having from a broader perspective in terms of kind of family office, patient capital, can look at deals on a risk-adjusted basis rather than trying to force deals. Yeah. Or I guess have the pressure of having to, as an operator, get capital out the door just to kind of not lose the capital, right? And so I guess you can do better deals with that type of capital in this current market. So yeah, that makes complete sense. So someone listening to this, what kind of sites and buildings are you actually looking at, kind of from a criteria perspective?
I think starting with where we want to own sites is typically where we think there's incumbent wealth, so people and businesses who are going to ultimately use the spaces that we're creating, and we think that wealth is going to hold up through cost of living crisis, through any type of recession, and actually it's going to be a relatively small cost to our consumers versus their earnings. So as a consequence, we've stayed pretty southeast focused. We bought one site in Milton Keynes, but other than that, we're in Kent, we're in Surrey. We'd love to be in London. We're looking at a couple of things very closely at the moment in London as pricing has kind of come to a level which we think now broadly works. So geography-wise, really it's southeast, M25 commuter towns in London is the focus. We've tended to go to places with either existing self-storage supply or very, very good industrial data, because that way we can understand the markets, understand how they perform, and say, okay, well, you might have 2 self-storage businesses working in this location, and you might have several industrial estates, but they all trade really well. They've all been there a number of years. There's been a fair amount of housing growth. All of the businesses working in the industrial estate, the quality of their space is all a bit secondary, because they will get pushed to the back. Can our product provide a good alternative or a follow-on to a market which is proven, rather than going and putting a new flag post down in a town or city which actually doesn't have any of the same supply currently, and kind of having to prove the whole concept. So that's been our starting point. Aside from that, we like slightly larger sites than the self-storage people, and probably slightly smaller sites than some of the industrial people. Typically there's a degree or an aspect of visibility in roadside, because that gives us the benefit of obviously people being able to see where we are, and that means assets tend to trade better. Generally we like being next to big either trade or retail occupiers. So our site in Milton Keynes, we've got a Halfords actually that we own, and a number of other trade units that we own as well. But directly opposite us, we've got a Wix and a Dunelm, and a number of other reasons why someone as a consumer would come to an area and therefore know about the area. Similarly, from a DPD perspective, they all know where it is, so they're not going to be driving around, which means from an e-commerce perspective, it's going to perform that much better.
It makes complete sense. And then I guess once you've accumulated a portfolio of particular size and scale, it's a hell of a lot easier to operate if they're in a kind of a localized area rather than scattered all across the UK.
Exactly. I also think the truth about operational real estate, especially lower cost industrial type operational real estate, is if you roll your sleeves up, you can, generally speaking, make most of these buildings work, as in from an operational perspective, because there's such a shortage of good quality space for small businesses and for domestic users in the storage space, in the kind of multi-let industrial workshop studio space. You can generally make these sites work, but the ambition from our side is obviously to build scale, and it's much easier to build scale if you build sites which are going to outperform rather than just work.
Yeah, makes complete sense. Can you talk to me about your team at the moment and how you've gone about hiring and who those individuals are in your business and what the kind of different roles are? Because there's a kind of a layer of challenge, isn't there, in terms of hiring and getting people in the right space to kind of deliver on your vision for it as well.
Yeah, sure. So we're a growing team. We are 3 full-time, 1 part-time, and about to be 4 full-time. I oversee all of the kind of bigger picture strategy, but also the vast majority of kind of key decisions on individual assets. So we've been buying pre-planning, so kind of taking sites up to planning. Then we've got a full-time development associate who kind of leads on actually taking sites through detailed design and getting them into contract, or tendering them, getting them into contract, making sure we've got the right builders, the right ground testing, making sure we've got the right insurances in place, and actually really kind of making sure that we're delivering very high quality, both from a design and an ESG perspective, but also from a long-term structural and MEP perspective, buildings that are going to work. The ultimate plan is that we think these types of spaces should be owned by institutions as kind of really high quality, really self-storage led portfolio, and making sure that we're doing everything we need to do that from a construction perspective is really Max's job. Then from an acquisitions perspective, we have the former number 2 real estate person at Zap, the delivery company, who effectively spends the vast majority of his time scouring the towns that we want to be in, identifying the sites that we want to own, and the vast majority of sites that we look at, and almost all the sites we bought have come through direct canvas and kind of working to get in touch with owners rather than market processes. And so that's where Ryan spends the majority of his time.
Originating sites.
Yeah. And then the third person who we're just in the process of onboarding and hiring is much more on the kind of investment, finance, asset management side of things. So helping us with various kind of debt processes we need to do for development finance for individual assets, for future debt processes, asset management of existing occupied spaces that we own. Part of our strategy has been to buy sites which are slightly larger and then sell bits off. And dealing with that churn and those disposals is something that's also going to sit within their job as well. Fascinating.
Well, look, talk to me about the plans for the next 12 months. What does that look like?
So we're really focused on industrial, and primarily we're really focused on self-storage and to keep scaling that. So we've meaningfully been deploying capital for 9 to 11 months. We bought 3 sites so far. It feels like the market has carried on going our way in terms of meaning that we're able to buy land, which is a commodity that's gone down in value, turn it into self-storage and other industrial uses, which is generally speaking use classes which have held up relatively well or fared relatively well. So we're really focused on continuing to build a best-in-class, highest quality, all BREEAM excellent, all net gain, majority net zero self-storage with ancillary serviced office and ancillary kind of consumer edge industrial type uses portfolio. So the plan would be a good scenario. We'd like to buy somewhere between 4 and 6 sites in the next 12 months.
Amazing. Well, look, Jacob, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I think your career and the learnings and how you've kind of denied the status quo and kind of reinvented yourself has been absolutely fascinating, and I'm really excited to see what you and the team go on to build. A question that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, and I kind of feel like I'm going to know the answer to this, but if I was to give you £500 million of equity, who are the people, what property, and which place would you look to deploy that capital?
So it's a really good question. I imagine similar to a lot of people coming on your podcast, I've very much planted my flag somewhere which we believe in and like to think we've got really high conviction, both on a macro and micro level, which is we're very committed to the consumer industrial space, especially committed to the self-storage space, and especially committed to building really high quality within that space, which is where we think values will start to differ between legacy assets and new build best-in-class assets. So that's what we would build. Yeah. Where we would build it, I think for the next 12 to 18 months at least, we're really interested in carrying on within the UK. We've spent a bit of time in Europe starting to look at those markets and starting to understand that as a longer-term ambition. And I think the UK's got quite negative sentiment around it right now. Remains to be seen whether that sentiment translates into negative long-term kind of headwinds. Obviously, our look-back GDP data is not great, and so actually preparing ourselves to apply all of the macro lessons learned from the UK industrial market, which tends to be a leader compared to European countries, and see if there's an opportunity to capitalize on some of that in Europe in the future is definitely something that we look at and talk about. And who with? I'd say the team that we're building.
And anyone else outside of your team or anyone in your network that you'd bring on the journey that you could say?
It's a really good question. I think there's a degree to which too many cooks spoil the broth, but I would definitely say that one of the things I've been most fortunate with is every single person I've worked with and every single capital partner investor that we currently have or I've worked closely with, I've learned so much from. So I think if I was to have one other thing I would be able to do would be to build a much broader investment committee of different people to provide input into all the different things we do. That said, very challenging to do because everyone's super busy.
And if I was going to really press you and say, look, you can't have any of your strategy, any of your people or anything that you're doing at the moment, which sector would you look to kind of deploy that capital into?
If we couldn't do anything that we're doing at the moment, I'm not sure it's quite there yet. It's certainly getting there. I've been saying that for a little while and just kind of watching for it to bottom out. And it has in various markets, but there's just not that many transactions around. There will be an amazing opportunity in offices. That opportunity is because if you provide the right space and you provide the right provision for users and actually the right level of service and integration at the right price point, there's always going to be small businesses, founder-led, founder-owned, founder-run, who work in those buildings that want to see their staff a few times a week, that don't want to go through the pain of signing a 5 or 10 year lease. So our original general people thesis from 7 years ago, I completely still subscribe to today, and I think the buying opportunity for that is also very good.
Fascinating. Well, look, like I said, I'm so excited to see what you and the team go on to build, and I've got every confidence that you're making an absolute roaring success, because you found a way and you've worked it out, and I'm excited to see what you guys go on to do.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
Not at all. Well, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks for listening to this episode of the People Property Place podcast. If you found it insightful, feel free to share it with a friend or colleague. Subscribe, give us a rating, like or comment. It helps tremendously. It'd be great to hear from you on LinkedIn. I'm super open-minded to recommendations of guests we should get on the podcast, or areas of the market we should explore further. So do drop me a message. The People Property Place podcast is powered by Rockborn. The team recruit experienced talent for investors, owners, developers, and operators. So if you're considering your career options at the moment, or looking to attract top talent to work for you, head over to the website www.rockborn.com, where you can find a wealth of research to aid your search. Have a great day wherever you are, and I look forward to catching you next time.